Frank stood in stunned silence beside the jeep, his eyes fixed on the grisly sight that greeted him at the entrance to the prison compound. Above the imposing gates, a row of weather-worn skulls served as macabre sentinels, their bleached bones stark against the backdrop of what had once been a thriving forest, now reduced to a chaotic expanse of rubble and ruin. The warehouse, transformed into a fortress of despair, loomed ominously ahead, its walls fortified with makeshift barricades amidst the scarred ruins. The scene resembled a desolate moonscape, scarred by craters that dotted the barren earth like wounds inflicted by unrelenting warfare. Shattered remnants of civilian vehicles lay strewn across the terrain, their twisted frames silent witnesses to the violence that had ravaged this once green sanctuary. The forest, stripped bare of its verdant canopy, stood as a skeletal testament to the devastation wrought by conflict, a wasteland where echoes of suffering and distant cries mingled with the oppressive silence. Before Frank, the three soldiers who had escorted him bore expressions hardened by battle, their eyes conveying a mix of weariness and detachment. They regarded Frank with a cold intensity that sent a chill down his spine. One soldier, his face twisted into a cruel smirk, jabbed Frank with the barrel of his weapon, eliciting mocking laughter from his comrades. The officer, a figure of authority amidst the chaos, glanced at Frank before motioning silently. In an instant, rough hands seized Frank, pulling the burlap sack over his head and plunging him again into disorienting darkness. Suddenly, a violent blow knocked Frank off balance, sending him sprawling to the ground. His body collided with the unforgiving earth, the impact jarring his already weary limbs. The soldiers wasted no time in dragging him across the rugged ground, the harsh sound of metal clinking and the groan of the gate marking their entrance into the prison compound. Frank, utterly drained from days of torment, offered no resistance as they pulled him through the dirt. His knees scraped painfully against the ground as he realized they were ascending a flight of stairs, each step intensifying the ache in his battered body, a stark reminder of his captivity's unyielding grip. Finally, they reached a decrepit room where Frank's head collided painfully with the cold cement floor upon arrival. The soldiers worked with clinical efficiency, removing his restraints while one delivered a sharp kick to his side, forcing him onto his back. With his hands now cuffed in front of him, they exited the room, leaving Frank in suffocating darkness as the heavy metal door slammed shut. In the oppressive silence, broken only by faint beams of light filtering through cracks in the walls, Frank gasped for breath. He tore the bag off his head, expecting relief, only to be met with the overwhelming stench of decay that permeated the air. Gagging at the foul odor, he realized the bag had been a brief respite compared to the grim reality of his surroundings. In the dim light of the cell, Frank took in his bleak surroundings, a solitary metal cot beside him, the stark reminder that he had descended deeper into the clutches of captivity, trapped in a cycle of torment orchestrated by unseen forces. The air in the room was thick with the musty scent of dampness and decay, punctuated by occasional echoes of distant shouts and the muffled sounds of movement outside. The warehouse ruins bore scars of past violence, with cracks running jaggedly through the concrete and patches of dried blood staining the floor. Frank could feel the weight of history in the very walls around him, a silent witness to the suffering endured by those who had been held captive in this grim fortress before him. As Frank lay on the cold floor, the reality of his situation sank in deeper. His body throbbed with pain from the recent mistreatment, every movement a reminder of his vulnerability. Yet, amidst the darkness and despair, a flicker of defiance ignited within him, a determination to survive, to endure whatever trials lay ahead in this desolate place. Outside the cell, the world seemed to carry on with its own muted rhythm. Occasionally, the distant rumble of explosions would reverberate through the ground, a reminder of the ongoing conflict that had reduced this once thriving landscape to a battleground. The air was heavy with tension, thick with the anticipation of what each passing moment might bring. Frank's thoughts raced, grappling with the uncertainty of his fate. How long would he remain imprisoned in this forsaken place? What had become of his mission, the mission that had brought him into the crosshairs of these merciless captors? Time seemed to stretch endlessly in the suffocating silence of the cell. Frank's senses were heightened, attuned to every sound and movement beyond the walls. Each creak of metal, each distant footstep, stirred a primal instinct within him, a constant vigilance born of survival. Through a narrow slit in the wall, a faint glimmer of light pierced the darkness, casting a feeble beam onto the cold floor. Frank's gaze fixed upon it, a small beacon of hope amidst the despair that threatened to engulf him. He knew he had to find a way out, to reclaim his freedom and unravel the mysteries that had led him into this nightmarish ordeal. But for now, he lay still in the darkness, his mind racing with unanswered questions and his body weary from the trials of captivity. The journey ahead seemed daunting and uncertain, a labyrinth of danger and deception. Yet, amidst the bleakness, a determination burned within Frank, a resolve to defy the malevolent forces that sought to break him and emerge victorious, against all odds, from the grasp of darkness. As Frank lay on the cold, unforgiving floor of his cell, his mind raced with turbulent thoughts of vengeance for the countless comrades who had fallen in battle. Each heartbeat echoed the weight of their sacrifice, and a shiver coursed through his body as he grappled with memories of a life that felt like a distant dream. The vibrant world he once knew was now overshadowed by a haunting fear. What awaited him after the war? What kind of world could ever accept a soldier who had become both a survivor and a reluctant monster? In the depths of his mind, Frank searched desperately for answers, hoping to quell the demons that tormented him. Images of the trenches flooded his thoughts, muddy landscapes filled with chaos, the sounds of gunfire and cries of anguish forever etched into his memory. Each recollection brought a fresh wave of despair, amplifying the uncertainty that loomed ahead. Suddenly, a harsh clang of metal shattered the heavy silence, reverberating like a hammer driving a spike into the ground. The cell door creaked open, revealing two soldiers. One held a long black club, while both wore malicious grins that seemed to mock his suffering. They stepped inside, their heavy boots echoing on the concrete floor, and positioned themselves on either side of him. The air thickened with tension as a loud crack of electricity snapped through the room, illuminating the darkness. Frank's heart raced as he realized the weapon was no mere club. It was an electrified device, designed for pain. Instinctively, he rose to his feet, driven by a primal urge to avoid the imminent threat. The soldiers seized him by the shoulders with iron grips, their hands like shackles, and began escorting him out of the cell. They navigated the dimly lit hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. At the end of the corridor stood a small room, a grim replica of his cell. As they entered, Frank hesitated, taking in the stark surroundings. A few wooden chairs and a simple table stood in the center, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. With a rough shove, they forced him into one of the chairs, positioning him squarely at the table, facing the entrance. One soldier leaned in, muttering something incoherent under his breath as he locked Frank's handcuffs to the table, the cold metal biting into his skin. After securing him, the soldier stepped back into the corner, his eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. The second soldier took up position in the opposite corner, both men standing like silent sentinels. Frank sat in a daze, the dim light from a solitary bulb hanging overhead casting a sickly glow across the room. The oppressive silence was punctuated only by the distant echoes of torment from within the prison walls, a grim reminder of his reality. The soldiers stood guard in the shadows, their eyes locked onto him, scrutinizing his every movement with a chilling intensity that deepened his sense of isolation. In that moment, Frank felt the full weight of his captivity pressing down on him, each heartbeat a reminder of the darkness that surrounded him. The world outside faded into obscurity, leaving only the echo of his own breath and the relentless gaze of his captors. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as Frank sat, handcuffed to the rough wooden table, each second amplifying the pain coursing through his body. The weight of his captivity hung heavy in the air, and in the shadowy corners of the dimly lit room, the two soldiers loomed like vultures, their eyes boring into him with a predatory intensity that made his skin crawl. Without warning, the heavy door swung open, slamming against the wall with a resounding thud. Frank's nemesis stepped into the room, his presence a storm cloud of malice. The officer's arm was still secured in a makeshift sling, a painful reminder of their previous encounter at the police station. He approached Frank with a menacing swagger, an aura of ill intent radiating from him. As he reached Frank's side, he unleashed a savage punch to Frank's jaw, the impact reverberating through his skull. Stars exploded in his vision, and a ringing filled his ears, momentarily transforming reality into a chaotic blur. As the haze began to lift, Frank caught sight of a second figure entering, a higher-ranking officer, distinguished by his crisp uniform adorned with gleaming medals that told tales of battles fought and lives lost. This man was clearly a general, and the weight of his authority pressed heavily on the room. The officer who had just struck Frank reared back for another blow, but the general's commanding voice sliced through the tension like a blade, halting him mid-motion. A terse exchange followed, words exchanged in clipped tones that conveyed both reprimand and authority. Moments later, the officer and the two guards exited, leaving Frank alone with the general, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. With a glint of mischief in his eye, the general took a seat across from Frank, leaning back with an air of casual dominance that made Frank's blood run cold. He reached into his pocket, producing something that represented the very essence of Frank's existence. His crumpled, blood-stained map, marked with the sacrifices of those who had held it. The general laid the map on the table with a deliberate slowness, as if savoring the moment. Then, with a flourish, he pulled out a fresh pack of cigarettes, the packaging crisp and almost tantalizing. He extended his arm toward Frank, offering him one of the fine smokes, only to withdraw it just out of reach, a taunting gesture that cut deeper than any blow. Frank's eyes fixated on the pack, a deep craving rising within him for the sweet relief a cigarette could bring. Yet, he fought against the urge to show any sign of weakness in front of this new adversary. The general chuckled softly, clearly enjoying his small victory over Frank's pride. He lit his cigarette with a flick of his lighter, the flame momentarily illuminating the shadows that enveloped them. With each slow drag, he exhaled smoke rings into the air, a smug grin on his face as if Frank's predicament was nothing more than an elaborate joke. In the midst of his amusement, the general's gaze landed on one of Frank's few remaining treasures, his expensive watch. Despite the grime and dried blood that marred its surface, the watch still caught the light, sparkling defiantly. A wicked smirk spread across the general's face as he leaned forward, snatching the watch from Frank's wrist with a predatory quickness, securing it onto his own. Frank's heart sank. This watch had left his possession before, only to return under grim circumstances. He could only hope the curse surrounding it would hold true. Despite his determination to remain stoic, a small grin crept onto his face, an unspoken acknowledgement that the clock was ticking down to a deadly confrontation, whether between him and the general or against death itself. The general leaned back, momentarily admiring the watch, before turning his relentless gaze back to Frank. The room was heavy with silence, the air thick with the echoes of distant battles that seeped through the cracks of the aging walls. Staring at each other, their eyes locked in a battle of wills that felt like an eternity. Finally, the general let out a low, frustrated growl. He reached across the table, snatching up the map and sliding it back into his jacket pocket with a finality that made Frank's stomach churn. With one last penetrating look, the general turned and exited the room, slamming the door behind him. In that moment, Frank felt as though he had won a small battle, but the war raged on, dark and unrelenting.